I want to follow this up by talking a little bit about our experience of entropy and how we are living it out, how it's living itself out through us in our everyday life. It goes on so conditionally, so automatically, so reflexively that we don't really pay attention to it until we are asked to pay attention to it, to remember to pay attention, so we become aware of its existence in our lives, and becoming aware of it, we can then focus to make change and turn it around and reverse it. And in effect, by reversing it, we're stopping time. We're reversing the arrow of time. So a very interesting point comes up again in the wisdom literature, having to do with the story of Exodus. That's been given to us in the 5 books of Moses. And the story of Exodus has to do with removing ourselves from the entrapment, from the enslaved world, the world of endless death, the preoccupation with the cult of death. And as Steinsaltz has said in his essay, in the Exodus from Egypt, the Jews left a vast civilization that was obsessed with death and that devoted much spiritual energy and material resources to preparations for the hereafter. The cult of death was one of the evils from which Moses led the children of Israel, guiding them toward a more wholesome outlook that puts the stress on life. So the Jews never equated death with holiness, and cadavers, far from being treated as objects of sanctity and adoration, are regarded as impurities from which one must keep a distance. So the exodus from Egypt has to do in a higher metaphysical sense, which is applied and applicable to our everyday life situations, having to remove ourselves from the entrapment, the enslavement of the everyday life circumstance that we've been born into. We went from one, the great one, to two, the cell and the ovum and the sperm. Then we went from that two to self-organization, and then we're born again into the world of duality of two, which is the splitting apart and coming into a world of entropy and breakdown and that cult of death that pervades the world from the beginning of recorded history all over the world, not just in Egypt. And now we're asking ourselves to reverse that again, to come back and reunite ourselves, our bodies and our souls, to come back to reunite our material life and our non-material existence called the soul, and to bring them back into one. So the object then for our experience and for our inner self-knowing and turning to ourselves as the agents for our own healing, to become our own doctors, which means our own self-educators, is to then become aware and present to these entropic functions going on. What is it that in life makes us enslaved? How do we become enslaved? Because it's around us all the time. And constantly there are enslaved experiences that we're facing day in and day out that are calling us to live them out. And by living them out, as I mentioned in a previous video, we are at every moment existing as a physical, emotional, mental, social, and moral being. So our existence at every instance, we're living in and as those 5 elements in ourselves that are living themselves through us. And so whatever we're doing in the social world, the mental world, the emotional world, has its physical reflection as well. They're all reflecting each other. So we have to be on the lookout to be wary and to avoid the traps that are happening that are keeping us enslaved. We're born into a slave world, and one of our purposes of living is to extract ourselves from the slave world, to make the exit from the Egypt of our inner life. And in the same moment, we're also extracting ourselves from the Egypt of our outer life. We have the possibility of taking charge of that inner life to see what those enslaved situations are that are there for us. I'll give you a thumbnail now because I hope to enlarge upon this later on. But just some of the things to be aware of that create enslavement for us. 3 of them that I'll share with you. One of which is that your mood is determined by what somebody else says, does, thinks, or feels. That you are shaped by the external circumstances around you, and therefore are conditioned in a reflex condition response mode to respond and reflexively respond conditionally, habitually, to whatever it is that comes at us from the external world. And so in our social circumstance, you see the enslavement begins to take over, because your response is conditioned by what somebody else says, does, thinks, or feels. So you are then becoming a slave to them. When you become a slave, then we're engaging in the most destructive function that exists on the earth, which is called idolatry. We're creating an idol, and in creating an idol, we are bowing down to it, and when we're bowing down to it, we're becoming weak and vulnerable, and our physical existence is beginning to deteriorate. We're creating our own deterioration. We are really creating in our own mistake of living existence, the error of living, we're creating our own demise, you see. We're choosing death. I set before you life and death, choose. I set before you idolatry or freedom, choose. So I set before you slavery and freedom, choose. So we have the choice at each moment, life or death. So one of them, of course, is being shaped by what somebody else says, does, thinks, or feels, and you're responding to them reflexively, habitually. The second is making somebody or something more important than you. So what you make more important than you, or who you make more important than you, because there's nobody on earth that's more important than you. There's nobody on earth that you are to bow down before under any circumstance, under any situation, no conditions, no exemptions. You're not to bow down before a human. That is to say, then you're making that human more important than you, and therefore you're calling yourself a slave to that which you're making more important than you, and to whom you're making more important than you. And as soon as you're doing that, you're idolatrous. And then the whole situation is occurring inwardly on the physical and emotional and mental spheres as well. And the body and this physical material body is beginning to dissipate its life energy, and the life energy is beginning to be siphoned off, and the organ systems are beginning to break down, and eventually we're creating that agedness that is we are believing inevitable to take place in our lives. That's the second one. The third one is lying down on the altar of the aberrant or dysfunctional or deranged needs of another human being. So and so we give ourselves away and cede, C-E-D-E, we cede our power, we relinquish our power by lying down on the altar of what another person considers to be the needs that you must fulfill for him or her. Lying down on the altar of the other was the original contract that was created, the holy contract that was created between Abraham and God. The original covenantal agreement, which is a holy agreement, and in those conversations that take place in the beginning of Genesis that are described, the sum and substance of it has been, look, there are 750 tribes around you, Abraham, that are participating in this murderous rampage against human beings, against adults and children, putting them on the altar, sacrificing them to the gods for greater crops and propagation of their own, of the ones who are in power, propagating their families, and greater flocks of animals and so on, more rain, whatever it is that they need. They would sacrifice these 750 tribes on these altars to rip their hearts out and destroy them. And they were murdering these people left and right, all around them. And we were enjoined by this covenantal agreement to, as Bob Newhart said in a very famous comedy presentation that he did, where he said the answer to all the questions that you have is to stop it.
It's just two words. We find most people can remember them.
Okay.
You ready?
Yes.
Okay, here they are. Stop it!
I'm sorry?
Stop it!
So Abraham was told, stop it. Here's the way to stop it. We have to stop this endless, murderous, lying people on the altar of the needs of others for the purposes of survival of the fittest and domination and subjugation, and of creating a master-slave civilization in the world, throughout the world. So we have to stop this murderous activity, stop lying down. And so in our own personal experience, in our own lived experience with others, you're watching yourself unnecessarily burdening yourself by lying on the altar of the needs of another, who are trying to make you feel guilty or ashamed, or in some other way extracting some sort of debt from you, or some other need that they need that they can't take care of themselves, presumably, and wanting you to sacrifice yourself on their altar. That's a third form of enslavement. There are others, but it's very significant now to pay attention at this point to those three, because you can see them very clearly in your everyday life if you begin to reflect and observe your everyday life situation and how you're functioning in that everyday life situation. So with that, I would say for this time and for our get-together today, blessings and love, and we'll get together soon. Thank you.